Well, my name is Mark D. Allen, PhD. I'm a neuroimaging expert, and I'm going to be talking to you about two different imaging technologies that are used in concussion assessment and treatment. And these are SPECT and fMRI. And I'm going to cover each of these in turn and sort of give you an idea of how they work in a very basic sense, and then what their strengths and weaknesses are, specifically with respect to concussion and concussion treatment. Both of these technologies rely on blood flow measures. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about blood flow in the brain, and then I'll refer back to that when I talk about these two approaches. The thing I want you to keep in mind, though, is that when we're talking about these approaches, that they're going to be strengths and weaknesses, and it's a matter of getting the right tool for the right job. So I'm not going to say something like, well, SPECT is completely useless, it's, for anything, or fMRI is totally great or completely useless for whatever, purpose. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, and it has to do with what you want to know, what information you want, and what the medical application is. Going back to this blood flow issue, let me just kind of sketch out a cartoonish image of the brain here, and then a even more cartoonish depiction of how blood flow enters the brain through the major feeding arteries to the brain. And so one fact about blood flow to the brain is that it's very highly regulated. The blood flow needs to be enough that the brain always has a steady supply of blood, but it needs to be not too much that it's an oversupply of blood that can be dangerous. So the brain is constantly regulating how much blood can get into it through these major contributing arteries. And then also the arteries throughout the brain also control blood flow in the other vessels as well. So that you have, at any given time, kind of this overall perfusion, it's called, or flow of blood, amount of blood that's in the brain that can fluctuate depending on things like blood pressure or oxygen need and so on. Okay, so we have this overall blood flow phenomenon, but also when we're talking about concussion, we're talking about specific cognitive disabilities that come from concussion, and that's what we're very interested in assessing and treating. And so there's a further blood flow factor that's associated with specific cognitive activity or mental activities. So when you're engaged in a mental activity, you'll use different parts of the brain to do any given mental activity, and these can be really discrete areas where you have one or more involved in something like a memory task or a concentration task or so on. And so I can depict that with as when some little area of the brain is needed more in a mental task, the brain is good at getting blood flow right to, or near where that region is, or around that specific region, over and above what's going on with the major flow into the brain and throughout the brain. So these little kind of local rises in blood flow in response to a cognitive demand for that area is referred to as neurovascular coupling, NVC. Okay, and so throughout the course of let's say that we're trying to memorize a list of words. Well, you'll have little areas of activity that are involved throughout, let's say, the frontal cortex here. You'll have some language areas activated, some word retrieval areas, and so on. And what we're interested in concussion assessment and treatment is how well are these little areas getting the blood supply that they need right when they need them. Okay. Now with that as a background, let me start by talking about how the SPECT technology works. Okay, so in SPECT scanning, what happens is that the person undergoing the scan is injected with a radioactive isotope. That sounds really scary, but it's really not that bad. It's safe. Okay, so that's not the drawback that you should really be worrying about in SPECT imaging. So the patient or the interested person undergoing the scan will be brought into a room and injected with a radioactive isotope. And then once that's injected, blood flows into the brain. Okay, so let's say that this is the radioactive element flowing into the brain and throughout the brain, okay? And then, so the purple is depicting this radioactive isotope. Now what happens is this radioactive isotope emits gamma rays as it decays. Okay, so it's got a certain amount of time that it's going to stay alive before it all decays out. But each time, as it decays, it emits these gamma waves. Okay, that can be detected, and so the SPECT scanner then uses what's called a camera or detector that can assess how much of this gamma radiation is coming out of any particular part of the brain. The way it does it is it moves this detector to different locations and then re-images and then moves and re-images. And then by collecting all these different locations, it can give you a picture in 3 dimensions of how much overall radiation there was being emitted from any particular part of the brain. As I talked about, in concussion assessment and treatment, we're interested in specific brain regions and the cognitive tasks that those brain regions do, because this could be selectively damaged in concussion. You have some brain regions that are working great, others that aren't. And that's just kind of the way the pathology works. And so in an imaging sense, what we're really interested in concussion treatment is getting at these discrete, smaller brain regions, rather than just looking at the overall, how well the whole brain is behaving in terms of blood flow. Now, this is a problem in SPECT imaging, because the way that SPECT imaging works with respect to cognitive tasks is that it gives you kind of just an overall an overall picture of how blood flow throughout kind of larger regions of the brain, lobes, let's say, of the brain, rather than very specific regions. And the reason this has to do with how the task is administered and measured. Okay, so as I said before, in a SPECT exam, the patient is injected with the radioactive isotope. And so in practice, how the imaging works is that the patient is injected, and then right after they're injected, they engage in the activity at interest. So let's say this is a concentration task. Okay, so they're given some concentration tasks that they do. Okay, and then during that time that they're engaged in the task, blood will be flowing all throughout the brain. In other words, the radiation will be flowing into the brain, the radioactive isotope, and it will, where there are areas that are more engaged in the task, there will be more of that radioactive isotope present. Okay, now this all happens prior to when they're even imaged. So they sit in a room, they do this task, the radiation collects in all these areas of the brain. Then they go and get imaged, so these cameras are placed. And this is, maybe 15 minutes or more after they've been injected, at least. And so these cameras are kind of picking up after the fact where stuff was going on while they were doing the concentration task. Well, the thing is that where stuff was going on was everywhere, because any cognitive task, like I said, it engages discrete regions, but those discrete regions are all over the brain. And so if you're only looking at kind of these gross level blood flow measures, you're basically going to get big areas that are detected. And this is a limitation in what we call spatial resolution. Spatial resolution. Okay, so that's a limitation in SPECT imaging, is spatial resolution. Another limitation is then also temporal resolution. So temporal or over time resolution. Okay, so cognitive tasks, when you're actually engaged in thinking, you're doing a lot of things fairly quickly. So even something like a memory task, you're given some words to memorize, second by second, your brain will be engaging different regions at different time courses, but they're all relatively fast. In other words, these are things going on a second by second level, if not sub-second by sub-second, not necessarily at a minute by minute level. So there isn't really a cognitive task that you can engage in that takes actual minutes to do. There isn't a thought that takes minutes to have. Those thoughts are very quick. Most activities that go on are very quick in your brain. And so SPECT is measuring events that are assumed to happen over minutes, which is not really very realistic, as there aren't really mental tasks that happen over minutes. What we want to get at are things that happen over second by second. And so this is where I'll contrast the technique with functional MRI with SPECT at this point. Okay, so now let's talk about functional magnetic resonant imaging very briefly. It's a very complex topic, and you could watch hours and hours long lectures on it. And so I'm just going to give you a really kind of simplified version of what's going on. In MRI imaging in general, the technique, it works as follows. You have magnets and radios, basically those two elements, okay? And so you have some tissue in the body, so this little bit of body tissue, and it gets magnetized, okay? And so I'm going to use kind of this little symbol to represent magnetization of that little bit of tissue. Then you have another area that's magnetized some other way, and another area that's next to it that's magnetized in some other way. And so you apply magnetic fields, and you kind of manipulate those magnetic fields so that different tissues are magnetized at different levels in different directions and so on. And that's a really simplified version. The other component to it is a radio wave. Okay, so then you send a radio wave through that tissue, and the radio wave will be affected or either amplified or de-amplified depending on how the magnetic field is behaving in that tissue. Okay, so the resonance part is that the radio wave resonates with the magnetic field, and it can boost it or not boost it. And so the way the technology works is that it picks up in 3 dimensions these boostings of the radio signal, and that allows you to distinguish where different tissues are in the brain, and that's just radiomagnetic resonant imaging. Functional MRI works in a way that has to do with blood flow again, because the blood that has oxygen in it behaves magnetically different from blood that doesn't have oxygen in it. So that purple will be the blood with less oxygen, deoxyhemoglobin. The red is blood with oxygen. They have different magnetic properties, and there are a lot of twists and turns in the story of how it works, but the bottom line is that oxygenated hemoglobin ends up, or the oxygen-rich blood ends up boosting the magnetic signal. Well, what it really is that the non-oxygenated blood disrupts the field, the magnetic field. And so you're picking up that disruption, you're picking up that boosting, and this allows you then to not only image just the tissue of the brain, but where flow is increasing and decreasing, but unlike with SPECT imaging where this would happen at a very gross level, so let's say at the level of a region like this, now you're able to look at very small regions, like let's say on the millimeter level as opposed to on the centimeter level. Okay, so what I've been talking about now, remember when we were talking about SPECT, this is spatial resolution. Okay, so that's spatial resolution. And functional MRI has far superior spatial resolution. The other component then, temporal resolution, is also important because like I said, if you've got lots of discrete regions that are involved, sure, fMRI can pick up those regions well, but if there's poor temporal resolution, basically you're picking up the whole brain because you're picking up everything that happened over time. So over the last 5 minutes, all of these areas were activated. It's going to show almost the whole brain being activated. So what you want then is temporal resolution. And that's where functional MRI is far superior as well, because you can pick up, depending on the scanner that you have and the techniques that you're applying, you can pick up things on less than a second level resolution. The only limitation, though, there isn't any limitation to the physics, because this stuff happens fast. The magnetization and the radio frequency stuff is very fast. It's really just the blood flow itself that's slow. So that response is something that happens on more of a second by second level. And so because of the physiology, you're stuck with the temporal resolution that's on the second by second level. But that's great, because that will allow you to distinguish activation in these discrete regions of the brain. They're passing around bits of information, but they're doing so in matters that are on the course of second by second. So you can go through and image the brain and determine when activation was happening at each point, not just where that activation was happening. And that's key to how we do assessment in functional MRI for the application of concussion pathology. Let's turn back to concussion, all right? And I talked about that principle of neurovascular coupling, remember? Okay, so in concussion, it seems like there's a problem in the mechanism that brings blood to targeted areas of brain. You might have parts of the brain that are working mostly well, but there seems to be something that goes wrong in getting that really fine-tuned blood flow to those regions. And so this technique, then fMRI, becomes useful in concussion assessment, because we can look at where neurovascular coupling is deficient across the course of a task. So within engaging in cognitive tasks, you might have different regions, popping up on a second by second level, and depending on where those fit in the chain of the process of the network, you could have neurovascular coupling down at one time in one region and not down when it's part of a different task. And so you get these very complex interactions between the cognitive task, the specific region involved, and neurovascular coupling. How this is important in concussion treatment is that we're able to look at where and when neurovascular coupling falls apart, and under what conditions, under what cognitive tasks are the ones that are creating problems in different regions. And then in treatment, what we can do is go back on that information and engage the patient in different tasks that will allow them to redistribute the blood flow appropriately. So we have tasks that will favor regions that are being undersupplied and disfavor regions that are being oversupplied, and kind of re-regulate those processes through the understanding of what this functional map gave us. And so that's how functional MRI is crucial to the treatment process at Cognitive FX.